Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are in the world, and welcome to the online COP27 side event, Is Natural Gas the Solution to Decarbonise Shipping? I'm Michelle Vesey-Bogman, Markets Editor and Analyst for global maritime news provider Lloyd's List, and I'll be your moderator for this event. We've assembled a stellar panel to debate and discuss whether methane is going mainstream in international shipping. And yes, you've heard that right. As the world seeks to reduce its reliance on fossil fuels, one of the most damaging greenhouse gases is being touted as a so-called transition fuel as shipping begins its decarbonisation journey. Maritime is a hard-to-abate sector, with a global international fleet of some 50,000 vessels consuming nearly 300 million tonnes of fuel oil a year as it transports 80% of global trade. So this year, 15% of new ships ordered for construction at shipyards over the next 3 years or so can run on liquefied natural gas, which is mostly methane. By 2025, there'll be more than 1,000 ships trading with dual fuel LNG engines. Some of them will be the biggest container ships ever built and the ones delivering consumer goods to your doorstep. So is natural gas the solution? Using LNG for marine propulsion to lower greenhouse gas emissions in shipping is highly contentious. The environmental benefits are disputed and subject to rigorous scientific and regulatory debate. There's no Tesla equivalent for shipping. LNG proponents argue that because there are no alternative fuels, LNG is the only one available at commercial scale for shipping to begin a zero emissions pathway. So let's get started and introduce everyone. I'd like to first welcome our keynote speaker. Lisa Kopakwalik, President of the Inuit Circumpolar Council Canada, is delivering our keynote address, and lest we forget, will remind us all about the impact of global warming on her Arctic environment. On the panel, we also welcome Brian Comer from the International Council of Clean Transportation. Brian will look at future demand of LNG versus other alternative fuels. And testimony to Dr. Comer's academic rigor, he's been subject to many attacks by the LNG shipping promoters for his work highlighting the environmental problems of adopting LNG. Brian, welcome. And next I have Constance Dijkstra from Brussels-based non-government organisation Transport and Environment. Constance is a shipping campaigner focusing on LNG and biofuels. She'll talk about methane slip in LNG engines and the climate impact that the adoption of this fossil fuel brings to international shipping. And we also welcome Jutta Paulus, a policymaker and MEP from the Green Policy, also based in Brussels. Jutta will provide insights into how legislation can be used to promote cleaner fuels in shipping. The European Parliament is currently passing two important pieces of legislation to deal with shipping emissions as part of its Fit for 55 package. And we hope that you can unpack how regulators are dealing with this chicken and egg conundrum facing those wanting zero emission fuels. And so I'm also very pleased to welcome US Congressman Alan Lowenthal, architect and proposer of the Clean Shipping Act. The Act is modelled after the Fuel EU maritime legislation now in trilogue and has even more ambitious targets. So Congress Lowenthal represents the Port of Long Beach, one of the biggest import ports for containerized goods in the US. And finally, Jakob Steffensen, innovation lead from DFDS, provides us with the shipowner's perspective. DFDS is a passenger, ferry, and freight logistics provider based in Europe and working hard to reduce its environmental footprint against a backdrop of pending regulation. Smaller ships operated by DFDS have an opportunity to lead the way for zero emissions shipping, providing proof of concept that can be scaled up for larger ships. Welcome to you all. But first, I'd like to pass over to Lisa, President of the Inuit Circumpolar Council Canada. Lisa, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to be here with you all today. And thank you too for the invitation to speak today. I was in Egypt last week And I was left with a profoundly overwhelming sense from the sheer scale of the climate crisis. I also have hope, however, mainly because of the Inuit youth I met and other youth as well. They are strong, dedicated, and resilient. And Inuit are much the same way. And we have survived and thrived and created our culture by adapting and being innovative in the Arctic. We are a marine people who live in the circumpolar region, and our homelands transcend national borders, which makes us truly an international people. We are one people, one nation. Inuit have rights to a vast coastline and marine region. We are over 180,000 people in the circumpolar Inuit homeland, which we call Inuit Nunat. And we have occupied and used our Arctic homelands and the Arctic marine environment for thousands of years. The subject of safe, clean, responsible ships entering the Arctic is important to Inuit all across our homeland. Our economy and culture depend on low-impact shipping. We are also ship owners and wish to ensure that we continue to build up and support our shipping industry, the supply line to our communities. We live in a dangerous time for Inuit. I participated in one side event last week, which sounded the alarm about the rapid disappearance of Arctic sea ice, given our current global emissions reduction pathway. Sea ice is integral to Inuit culture, transportation, harvesting, and economy. Without it, and with it thinning, our way of life is disrupted in a profound way. The decline in sea ice is causing changes in atmospheric circulation patterns, resulting in more extreme temperature fluctuations around the world. My homeland is disappearing, but it's also the rest of the planet that is experiencing our suffering. Vulnerable communities such as ours didn't cause climate warming, but we're now the ones impacted the most. Wealthy countries are committing cultural genocide by continuing to allow GHG emissions to increase. This isn't a theoretical discussion for Inuit. It's happening now. It's very real for my people. What is very difficult is that we understand there are solutions which exist today that can reduce climate impacts on vulnerable communities. One that I've talked about many times this year, speech after speech, is the ability of shipping industry to reduce black carbon emissions. Switching to cleaner burning distillate fuels can cut black carbon by as much as 80%. No retrofitting or expensive investment. It can be done overnight. How much worse does it have to get? And how dire do predictions have to become before we take collective action? We're also concerned about the shipping industry's increased methane emissions, which is the focus of today's discussion. Methane is a potent greenhouse gas. Reducing global sources will benefit the Arctic. Methane is the second largest contributor to climate change and stronger than CO2 at warming the atmosphere. A major source of methane in the shipping industry is the use of LNG as a marine fuel. We need to support alternative marine fuel solutions other than LNG to reduce methane emissions from the shipping sector. Lastly, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples states that Indigenous people have the right to maintain, control, protect, and develop a culture and Indigenous knowledge. As Inuit, we have this fundamental right. What we're experiencing is that right being taken away by the world's appetite for fossil fuel use. This has to stop. We need to focus on renewable energy solutions that don't endanger the most vulnerable. Inuit recognized early that safeguarding the Arctic would protect the planet. However, these calls remain unheard. Climate climate actions need to be global in nature, which requires determination and collaboration, especially the inclusion of Indigenous voices as an important knowledge source. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lisa. Now that Lisa has highlighted the urgency and imperative of not using fossil fuels, Brian Comer from the International Council on Clean Transportation is going to give us a short overview about methane in shipping, and he's going to try and lay out the challenges and what we're dealing with. So Brian, over to you, but just a reminder that you've got nearly 8 minutes. So thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. And thank you, Lisa, for reminding everybody really what's at stake. I'll be presenting on methane slip, and it's really LNG's Achilles heel. We've seen rapid growth in methane emissions from ships over the last several years. And why? Methane slip. Methane slip refers to the methane that escapes unburned from marine engines. Next slide. High methane slip engines consumed 40% of liquefied natural gas marine fuel in 2017, and this is up from 20% just 6 years earlier in 2012. We also have medium methane slip and low methane slip engines. So the high methane slip engines are the most popular, but aren't the only option. Next slide. For ships that traded with the European Union, most of the LNG was used in the high methane slip engines in 2019, and we expect that share to grow by 2030. Next slide, please. And ultimately, because of methane slip, LNG is incompatible with the global methane pledge, which was agreed to at the last COP26. It was spearheaded by the United States and the European Union and has over 130 member states that have signed on to the agreement since then. And between 2019 and 2030, our research expects that demand for LNG as a marine fuel will triple. And if 100% fossil LNG is used to meet that demand, we expect methane emissions to triple as well, which is shown in the middle bar. What's really important is that even if we were able to shift from 100% fossil LNG to 100% renewable LNG made from biosources or renewable electricity and carbon capture, even if we were able to do that, which would cost about 7 times more for the fuel than fossil fuel, we would still double methane emissions between 2019 and 2030 when the global methane pledge is calling for a 30% reduction from 2020 levels by 2030. So global methane pledge compatibility would require cutting methane slip by at least 77%. Next slide, please. It looks like we're missing some of the bars. There's some red bars that are on top of the blue bars on these graphs that show you the contribution of methane slip. We'll be able to share the presentation with you afterwards. But the point is that on the left-hand side of the bar, the high methane slip engines result in higher life cycle emissions than using other alternative marine fuels like marine gas oil and methanol. And in order for them to be equivalent to marine gas oil or methanol, the high methane slip engines would need to reduce their methane slip by 90% to 100%. The medium methane slip engines would need to completely eliminate their methane slip, and the low methane slip engines are actually already better than using marine gas oil and better than just as good as using methanol, but they're the most expensive engine and they have the least popular engine. Next slide, please. Some options exist technically to reduce methane emissions from marine engines, but ultimately the levels of methane slip emissions reductions that are required, the 90% to 100%, are just not really achievable using technologies in a cost-effective way. Next slide, please. We can show the video. So I just wanted to give some advice on if you were to buy a new ship or if you already have an existing LNG ship. If you're buying an if you're buying a new ship, then you should choose to use low methane slip engines in your ship. But I wanted to warn ship owners, if you're choosing to buy a new LNG ship, researchers are measuring real-world methane slip from marine engines. This is a helicopter that our consortium is using to measure methane emissions from ships operating near Denmark. We're using helicopters, we're using drones, and we're using onboard measurements. This to measure actual methane emissions from marine engines, which we've found in many cases to be higher than what we've assumed in emissions inventories. And we're also measuring other sources of methane leakage from the fuel tanks and from the cargo tanks, which currently aren't accounted for in any emissions inventories. Next slide, please. So if you're going to buy a new ship, I would consider buying one with a dual fuel methanol engine, one that is supplemented with wind-assisted propulsion and hull air lubrication. All of these technologies are available today. And in the near future, plan on buying zero-emission vessels that use fuel cells and batteries within the next several years. Next slide, please. If you've already invested in an LNG fueled ship, which is going to last for 25 to 30 years, we recommend running it at optimal engine loads because methane slip is higher at lower engine loads. Use distillate fuels when you're operating in low engine loads. Use shore power in port. Test out batteries and fuel cells. Consider wind-assisted propulsion. And if these ever become cost-effective and widely available, consider methane slip reduction retrofits. And the last slide, please. Ultimately, until methane is regulated, ships are able to legally use high methane slip engines. The European Union is beginning to regulate methane starting in 2025 under its Fuel EU Maritime Initiative, but that could be much stronger in order to require that ships only use the lowest methane slip engines. And the United Nations International Maritime Organization is currently developing guidelines that will enable it to regulate methane from international shipping, but these regulations are still many years off until they start. And typically at the International Maritime Organization, the regulations start off quite weak, and it takes several more years to increase their ambition and their stringency to actually have a meaningful effect. Thank you very much for your attention, and looking forward to the panel discussion.
Thank you, Brian. So what I might do is head over to Jakob as the ship owner representative of this panel. Now, I think industry studies have shown that the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions from transferring to LNG vary from 6% to 23%, depending, of course, on the engine type. So Brian advised ship owners to focus on dual fuel methanol engines, wind-assisted propulsion, retrofits, etc. Are any of those on the table for DFDS or the industry generally? And why or why not are the alternative zero-emission technologies available?
Yeah, thank you for giving me the opportunity to give you a short update on what we are working with. And I really appreciate that Brian mentioned that these ships live for a long time. So already now we need to look into what will the ships actually look like and what fuels will they run on the ships that we have in 2050. So the companies who have an ambitious climate strategy, we need to start building the zero emission ships already now. As we have been discussing before, we have already several ship owners have already started this. To the untrained eye, I think that the zero emission ships of the future, they will look quite like the ships we have today if you look at them from the outside. But in the engine room, they will be quite different. They will run on different fuels that will be produced without any fossil fuels. And here we're talking about short sea shipping. We expect that they will be running on very short sea on batteries. A little bit longer short sea, they'll be running on hydrogen. And ships that really need to go longer distance, like also global, they will need to run on green methanol and green ammonia. We are a little bit concerned about all the fuels where you need a biogenic carbon molecules in order to produce them. So basically, it's convenient that we can start out with biofuels. Right now, they're here, we can get started. Also, it's saying we see the first mover ship owners, they are also going for methanol, which also requires this biogenic CO2. But in order really to scale zero emission shipping, we need to look at fuels that do not contain any carbon molecules. And here, green ammonia is a big candidate for that.
Right. It seems a natural point to move to Jutta and explain about what's going on now in the EU in order to reduce methane in shipping, and perhaps the difficulties in this chicken and egg situation that you have with, I think the industry agrees that renewable hydrogen is probably the best way to get there, but how can you shift an entire industry that's hard to abate?
Yes, that is indeed a difficult question, and it must be kept in mind that the first push towards LNG was not a climate issue, but a pollution issue. Especially for cruise ships, which did not want their passengers to look at all those billowing black smoke on the deck of this elegant cruise ship. So these were the first movers, so to speak, moving away from heavy fuel oil. That wasn't at all a climate issue at first. But as we now know, or more people have realized the climate impact of methane, it is, of course, also in our mind as policymakers that methane has to be regulated. And we have in Fuel EU Maritime, I am not content with the Commission proposal as it was brought out last year, but I'm also not content with the European Parliament's position, because I would have liked to see much more aggressive policies towards really future-proof fuels. Because if we move to biofuels, I mean, anyone who has looked at the globe will know that there are no new continents to be discovered where we can grow all those biofuels we would need for maritime and aviation. So basically, we have to make use of our land mass most efficiently. And this means, in my view, we should take advantage of solar producing 40 times as much energy per acre, and wind power producing 100 times as much energy per acre than growing biofuels. So I would have loved to see much more aggressive quotas for renewable fuels of non-biological origin, as they're called in EU language. You could also say e-fuels. And I'm pretty open there. I wouldn't say I, the policymaker, am smarter than all the technicians, and I will decide whether shipping should use hydrogen or methanol or ammonia. I only want to say, use a renewable source, do not pollute, and make sure that your fuel has the least climate impact. And the rest should be left to the technicians and the investors. But the more powerful instrument to work on methane emissions is actually not so much Fuel EU Maritime, where engines with a higher slippage rate are rated worse than good engines, so to speak. The more powerful instrument is actually the emission trading system, where maritime will be included. We are right now negotiating in which year how much percent of maritime will come into the ETS, and this will affect all ships entering or leaving European ports. So we are not looking at who is the owner, who is the flag state, who does the cargo belong to, or anything. It's just any ship above 5,000 gross tons, you're in. And we want to include methane also in the emission trading system. So that, of course, would be a large incentive to not invest in something that will not be a solution for 2050. Because it has been rightly said that even when using bio-LNG, you will still have the methane emissions. And a ship that is built today will still be sailing the sea in 2050 when the world should be carbon neutral. So in my view, let's push for the real future-proof fuels, which are renewable fuels of non-biological origin. Let's use ready-to-use solutions like slower steaming, which also saves emissions and pollution, of course. And why not use the cheapest source available, which is wind? Because a wind-powered ship, even with wind assistance, can harvest so much energy for free that I really don't understand why it's not deployed much more.
Thank you. Just to briefly summarize, the FuelEU maritime legislation begins to add curbs to the greenhouse intensity of fuels from 2025, starting, I think, with 5% and then building up to 80% by 2040. Now, Congressman Alan Lowenthal has introduced the Clean Shipping Act, which sets carbon intensity targets for shipping fuels and wants to eliminate import ship emissions by 2030. Some of these are tougher goals than what the European Commission is looking at. And so can I ask you, Alan, is there support to get this through Congress and the Senate? And are the goals set out in this bill realistic? What chance is there that it will get over the line?
Well, yes, they are realistic. I think that they're based upon the European Union. I think they go beyond the European Union, but we are very, very thankful to, first of all, the people on this panel, but also the European Union and the IMO for setting standards. But they're not going to get us to stay below those standards that have been set. Carbon intensity standards of fuels are not going to get us below 1.5 degrees centigrade. And so this bill, is just to really quickly say, requires life cycle carbon dioxide equivalent reductions of 20% by January 1, 2027, right away, 45% reduction based upon the 2024 baseline, 45% by January 1st, 2030, 80% from January, they have to have reductions by 2035, and 100% reductions from January 1st, 2040. And that's the standards. These goals are ambitious, but they're necessary, and our goals are give tremendous flexibility to the Environmental Protection Agency to adjust our goals to achieve the maximum possible emissions reduction while balancing other critical goals like public health, safety, technical feasibility over the course of the timeline of this bill. Under the framework of our Clean Air Act, our regulators can adapt to evolving conditions. And already our Environmental Protection Agency officials have welcomed this bill. It doesn't mean everybody supports it exactly, but they've welcomed it. And I'm proud of already our support from all the major US ports and from key industry partners, including Maersk. So we already have, with these very ambitious, beginning to develop a coalition and saying that these goals can be achieved. Now, you mentioned that, we've just gone through an election. Democrats who would be very supportive of these are the president and the Senate, but the Republicans will control the House of Representatives for the next 2 years in the 118th Congress. And they're going to resist, we believe, bold climate action. But the conditions are changing so fast. And where just a few years ago, many Republicans had denied the impact of climate change, that is changing. And as you pointed out, international shipping would be the 5th or 6th largest producer of greenhouse gases right now. And if we don't do something really bold, their numbers are going to dramatically increase, regardless of how we do. If we just regulate the intensity standards. In our country, the reason why this is going to pass is that it touches millions of Americans. 40% of this country lives within 3 miles of a port, either an inland port or a commercial port on our coast. And maritime pollution is a real concern for those communities and the communities I represent. Harmful emissions spiked during the 2020 to 2022 supply chain disruptions. High rates of asthma and pollution connected cancer are major killers in vulnerable communities. I'm not alone in Congress. This issue is before all of us. We are, regardless of party. I have the support of many of the business and environmental caucuses, such as the influential Sustainable Energy and Environmental Coalition. And as the bill gains support, it sends an important signal. It's time for the industry and for government to come together and make the investments and to be held to those regulatory standards for a sustainable future. And that's what the bill does. And it will pass. Maybe not right away, but it will pass.
And also, what about the money involved in setting up these initiatives? For example, how much will it cost to install clean ironing facilities or onshore electricity around the US at the ports? Who's going to pick up the bill for that?
Well, that's a very interesting question, because the United States has a highly decentralized port network with many different models. Sometimes it's ports around control of states and local government, like local government is the Port of Long Beach, which I represent. Other ports are merely landlord entities, so we don't have comparable and complete data on that. However, take a state like that I live in, California, it's already working to meet the goals in the bill. The 2020 at-berth regulations issued by the California Air Resources Board require that every vessel at berth in a California port either use shore power or approved technology to reduce harmful emissions. Tankers, which are docking at the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach, must comply starting in 2025, to have zero emissions at berth. And tankers in Northern California have till 2027. Even though this is decentralized, the federal government has a key role to play, and we have passed some of the most far-reaching legislation in the past 2 years. One was the Inflation Reduction Act, just passed this year, which puts in $3 billion for port electrification nationwide. What we did last year was called the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and that provides $450 million annually for the next 5 years for port infrastructure projects, including electrification. And we have tremendous amount of money, because we know that we have to put money into our grid to support these goals. And we will have, out of the $369 billion, much of that will be critical to strengthening our grid to support these kinds of changes in our ports. Right. So that's where we are. We're investing. The federal government is, but there's no one. Every port will not look like every other port. Much of that will be dependent at present by the states until we pass a bill like ours.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to move to you now, Constance. I'd like to talk a little bit about the possibility of LNG dual-fueled vessels becoming stranded assets, because, I mean, the argument against not using them is quite compelling. Billions and billions of dollars have been invested in these vessels. What are the risks, and why can't biomethane or e-methane become the pathway that many ship owners tout as a way to go from LNG to renewable LNG?
Right. So yeah, I mean, so we have the World Bank that has said that the basically the LNG infrastructure and LNG ships are essentially just going to prolong the use of fossil gas in shipping, and that's basically going to prevent the industry from reaching the climate goals set by the International Maritime Organization. And we have a recent study also that has been produced by the University College of London that says basically that LNG ships and infrastructure, like bunkering infrastructure, could be like at a risk of financial losses up to $850 billion by 2030. And the reason for that is that essentially it would start competing with zero emission shipping type of infrastructure as these become financially viable over time. But if we look also kind of like at the stranded assets argument from perhaps a bit more of a practical perspective, we have many people from including policymakers and industries who tell us that it's going to be quite easy then to kind of switch, you know, an LNG bunkering to then use hydrogen or ammonia. And we have some recent research that showed that while it is potentially feasible, it is coming at a huge cost, which is making us wonder whether actually people would want to actually pay for it after it's been like paid for like an LNG infrastructure to begin with. That it is also very challenging in the sense that you need to take into account that potential switch to ammonia and hydrogen right from the start because of the limited type of material that are available, etc. But in terms of perhaps just on the future of sort of biomethane and e-methane, I mean, in general, what we tend to say is that, you know, if you're going to have biomethane, that requires you to have a sustainable source of biomass that isn't going to compete directly with food production, that isn't going to compete or contribute to deforestation. And that source is pretty limited in number. So to say that biomethane is going to be, you know, a scalable solution for shipping is not going to be the case. That's for sure. And then on e-methane, you know, e-methane, firstly, I mean, as Brian kind of pointed out, we still have that methane slip issue that doesn't completely like basically disappear. And then the second thing is obviously that you're going to need that hydrogen, but you're also going to need a source of CO2, which is going to come with an additional cost.
Right. So we're just getting some questions from the listeners on the conference. So I'm going to put two of these forward to the panelists. One, I think Brian will want to take, but we'll see how we go. And the first one is there a viable retrofit pathway from LNG to ammonia? Jakob, you may want to take that one. And the second one is, that the production of e-fuels will require a significant amount of green electricity. And it cites these statistics from a paper that Intertanko, representing tanker owners, put into the IMO for next month's Marine Environment Protection Committee, saying that the energy needed to provide enough green ammonia is equal to 600,000 wind turbines, and obviously is quite a challenge. So the question I would put for Brian is, and how can this challenge be addressed? And then following that, over to you, Jakob, about a viable retrofit pathway from LNG to ammonia.
Thanks, Michelle. Well, on the future fuel options, the first thing I would say is that we need to do everything that we can to reduce the overall energy demand from ships themselves. So there's really no reason to continue to design ships the same way we have in the past. Zero emission vessels don't have to be a floating brick that we're trying to push through the water. We can retrofit wind assisted propulsion to reduce the amount of fuel that the ship needs. We can use we can use hull air lubrication to further reduce that. And then we can also better optimize the speed of the ships. It costs a lot more energy to go just a little bit faster, and it saves a lot of energy to go just a little bit slower. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that it's not necessarily the case that we're only going to be using ammonia in the future. There's some serious concerns about ammonia relative to safety and also relative to their greenhouse gas emissions, because while ammonia is a zero carbon fuel, its chemical makeup is nitrogen and hydrogen. When you burn it, you're going to produce nitrous oxide, N2O, which is a greenhouse gas 300 times more powerful than carbon dioxide. Thinking about the future fuel mix, what we need are the rules to reward using any fuel that meets 3 criteria. That on a carbon dioxide equivalent basis versus carbon dioxide, that you can evaluate it, using 20-year global warming potential, not just 100-year global warming potential, and that you look at a full well-to-wake accounting. And if the fuel can achieve zero or near zero emissions on a well-to-wake carbon dioxide equivalent basis using 20-year global warming potentials, any fuel will do. Right.
And over to you, Jakob. Is there a viable retrofit pathway from LNG to ammonia? Is there a way to dig out from the mess that it looks like shipping it's dug itself into?
Ships can be retrofitted, and you can retrofit from one fuel to almost any fuel, I guess. But you should really look at the viable thing. It makes no financial sense. It's much smarter from a ship owner's perspective to get this right from the beginning. Settle on a fuel that has a sustainable future ahead of it, and then go for that. But I imagine that all the ship owners going for LNG, they will be able to write some CSR wording that yes, this can be retrofitted, and yes, we will maybe be able to get a more sustainable LNG going forward. But we don't really believe that.
Right. Methanol, e-methanol, is that a solution for the industry? Can I ask you, Jutta, what are you saying as a regulator, and how are we going to find the money to persuade ship owners to invest in the technology and also fuel supplies, because that's the other side of the equation?
Yes, I think something weird has been happening to my camera. Sorry, I'm just trying to solve the issue. Okay. I mean, what we're trying to do is using policy. So we are not, unfortunately, I might say, as the European Union, we are not in the situation of the US, who have much more money to spend on this than we are. But we, at least as European Parliament, made an attempt, because what we were proposing is that the revenues from the ETS, from the emission trading system, where ship operators will have to buy certificates for their greenhouse gas emissions, that the part of the revenues would go into an ocean fund, which was meant to help the sector decarbonize. So collect money from the sector, but fuel it back into the sector in order to be able to finance research, development, help, especially for small companies, because in Europe we have a lot of companies that own maybe 2 or 3 ships, which cannot do the same investment as, for example, Maersk is doing. So this was our idea as Parliament, and right now we are in negotiations with the Council. And as you can imagine, in the Council, we have, of course, the finance ministers in the back that would say, no, I want to keep all this money for myself, and I want to decide myself how to distribute it. So that will be a fight. But I think that also in the Council, member states have started to understand that this is an opportunity. This is an opportunity also to get shipbuilding back to Europe, because we were a big shipbuilders economic bloc, but nowadays most ships are no longer built in Europe. And if we manage to invest smartly with grants, with aids, with loans into the modernization of shipbuilding, adapting shipbuilding to new fuels, to wind assistance, to new hulls, then this, of course, would give our industry a competitive advantage worldwide, because, as I said, everyone has signed the Paris Agreement. Everyone has to be carbon neutral by 2050. And I must also say, this sounds a bit, how should I say, ironic, but we are seeing more and more climate disaster hitting closer and closer to home. And so I think most governments will grasp that not investing today means having the tenfold damage tomorrow.
Thank you. Now, you mentioned the reason that the EU and the US are putting together their own regional legislation is because the global legislator, the International Maritime Organization, has been sharply criticized for its failure to set decarbonisation standards in shipping that are going to align with the 1.5 degrees Celsius warming. So over to you, Lisa. I mean, you mentioned that the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. So when that comes to global UN bodies like the IMO, how should the declaration be implemented, and how can that address climate emissions from shipping? How can you make the IMO aware of the imperative of doing something rather than kicking it out into the long grass?
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's a good question. And, Circumpolar Council has been participating at the IMO as provisional consultative status this year, and it's been very instructive for us. So as we participate in some of the working groups, for instance, during the underwater noise working group discussions, the chair set a really good example of a concrete step on how to implement the declaration. And he was supportive of including the engagement of Inuit and Indigenous people and the inclusion of Indigenous knowledge, a very important concept for us. So in the terms of reference for updating the voluntary underwater noise guidelines. So this type of inclusion of Indigenous knowledge and Inuit and Indigenous people can change how Indigenous people are considered and included in IMO rulemaking. And however, when I proposed a similar approach with the work of the correspondence group on black carbon, the chair in that working group wasn't amenable to the similar idea. Engagement with Indigenous people needs to be standard and across the board within the IMO. Also, the ICC full and permanent consultative status at the IMO should occur. And we're looking for everyone's support for that next year. There needs to be a systemic change at the IMO by seriously implementing the rights of Indigenous people, and decision-making will become more comprehensive and holistic there. And a holistic approach will bring in climate vulnerable voices, which will dramatically change the pace and urgency of dealing with the climate crisis at the IMO.
Well, you're certainly not the first one to criticize the decision-making processes at the IMO. I'm going to throw this out to the panel. I mean, why has the LNG lobby been so successful in tipping shipping towards another fossil fuel for decarbonisation at the IMO? How's this happened? Why have we been set off course? Brian, your hand's up. Can you explain why we are where we are?
Yeah, the reason why LNG has become so popular as a fuel is because the regulations that the International Maritime Organization has managed to muster actually push ship owners to using LNG as a new fuel because it checks all of the regulatory boxes that have been established by the IMO. The IMO regulates carbon dioxide emissions from new ships under its Energy Efficiency Design Index, but it ignores methane emissions and it ignores nitrous oxide emissions. We're hoping that will change. There's a proposal into the 79th Marine Environment Protection Committee meeting, which is going to be just in a couple of weeks, to regulate all greenhouse gases and black carbon under the EEDI for new ships. For new marine engines, they're regulated for nitrogen oxides, NOx, an air pollutant. the way to get really low NOx emissions is to run LNG in a high methane slip engine, and that's also the cheapest way to do it. And again, methane is not regulated, so this works as far as regulatory compliance. And for all ships have to use fuels with low sulfur content. LNG has almost no sulfur, so it checks that box. But again, methane isn't regulated. So we're looking for a more holistic approach to regulate pollution writ large, rather than one pollutant, the next pollutant, the next pollutant. Because as we've seen at the IMO, when we address one issue, we create a whole new one that we might not have even thought was going to be an issue in the future.
Thank you. Alan, I'll address this question to you now. So you're obviously looking to regulate regionally rather through this global approach with the IMO. Is that because you're sick and tired of the lack of progress? Because the common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities arguments put forward by some countries, are you just over this, and that's why you're looking to take charge regionally like the EU?
Are you asking me to answer that? Yes.
Yes,
and
please.
As you pointed out,
turned off.
Pardon?
You've turned your camera off.
Now it's on.
Thank you.
As you point out at others, progress at the IMO has been frustrating. But I don't think there's a conflict between a regional approach and a global approach. Our legislation includes a provision to waive our regulations if the IMO adopts equally stringent reduction goals. And our regulators are instructed to work to harmonize their efforts with European requirements. However, we cannot wait indefinitely. If industry opposes a regional approach and the potential compliance problems which this would create, they should facilitate action at the IMO because that's it. The IMO is frustrating to us, and we're going to move forward. And the United States is going to play a leadership role.
Thank you. I can't see whether Constance or Jutta put their hands up first, but you've obviously got something to say about that. Jutta, perhaps, or Constance?
Yes, very briefly. We have a similar
Yes.
article in our legislation which says if the IMO adopts similar provisions to decarbonize shipping, then the Commission should review this legislation. So we are basically doing the same as the US here. We're saying we're deploying this regional measure because we have no other choice. Because if we don't, nothing will happen at all, more or less. And I forgot one argument for the shipping sector to be able to invest. I mean, shipping is price inelastic, because even if prices would double, shipping would still be much, much more cost efficient than road transport or rail transport. So shipping would basically pass on the cost to the consumer. And as compared to even 2 decades ago, shipping has become incredibly cheap. Else it weren't possible that pears from Peru would be shipped to Vietnam to be peeled and to put into plastic boxes and then shipped to the US to be sold, crossing the Pacific twice. So shipping is maybe even too cheap if we want to really efficiently use energy. Thanks.
Thanks. Constance?
Yeah, no, just, I think on the IMO and the role that other world regions and countries have. So we've just published a small report that showed that 84% of the fleet, of the world fleet, stops, in China, in Europe, and in the US. So essentially, if we have those 3 countries or world regions that act together, there's like a real chance at decarbonizing shipping in first place. And then the second thing is we haven't talked about it too much, but it's that there's now a very big kind of excitement around green corridors and the idea of at least building sort of infrastructure that would work on 2 ports that are often that with many ships that go by from one country to another. And that's also a possibility of basically going a bit around the IMO.
So there's been a lot of talk about so-called green corridors, where that will facilitate the use of an alternative fuel at one port, and that's more or less, that's helpful for dedicated shipping routes. We're coming up to the final minutes, so I'll just get Jakob to respond about green corridors. I think DFDS is looking at some projects with green corridors. Are these viable? And then we'll come back and we'll sign off and let everyone have their final say.
Yeah, I think green corridors is almost like a no-brainer. Of course, if you want to introduce a new generations of ships and new fuels, you better start with some lines where you are in full control. It is more difficult to start globally. So yes, we are looking at several green corridors, and that is how we are going to implement it. And also great synergies with other segments. For instance, teaming up with farmers. They need the green ammonia as a fertilizer. We need as a fuel. Let's build a big factory and get the cost down.
Thank you. So my final question to each of the panelists is: where are we going to be in 5 years' time? I mean, personally, I feel a little depressed that the investment needed for alternative fuel and the industry support is there at a certain level, but perhaps not throughout the industry. Where will we be if we reconvene in 5 years' time? Can I start with Brian, please?
We'll see that the pace of buying new LNG ships has significantly slowed in favor of alternatives, especially methanol, as the risk of regulation and as new regulations actually do begin to enter into force, including Fuel EU Maritime in 2025, that finally start regulating methane as a pollutant from ships.
Thank you. Next, I'll go to Alan. Will your Clean Shipping Act be up and about and changing how the US deals with decarbonisation in shipping?
Oh, well, I certainly hope so, because in 5 years, we want to meet our first regulatory goal, and that is to reduce the carbon intensity of all fuels by 20%. And we have to meet those goals, even though it's not as large a goal. We have to begin to demonstrate that we're doing that. And, much of, the United States is a part, and we need to stand up and hopefully pass this legislation and say, greenhouse gases and climate change is such a crisis that if we don't do this, we're not going to meet our 1.5 centigrade goals.
Thank you. Jutta, well, the EU had dragged the IMO kicking and screaming into some sort of cohesive and effective policy on shipping decarbonisation.
Well, I believe in 5 years' time, we will see a lot of innovation, a lot of tests of new designs, of new wind propulsion, of new hull designs, because we have managed to get into the Fuel EU Maritime, which has a pooling mechanism, so that not each and every ship has to reduce the carbon intensity, but you can pool one very clean ship with ships which are too old to be retrofitted, for example. And we managed to put in an opening for smaller ships, because usually if you try out something new, you're not doing it on a huge container ship first. You're using a small ship to gather experience. And I think if this regulation gets through, we'll see a plethora of new designs, of experimental designs, which will then trickle into the market. And I also believe, like Brian, that the time for LNG is over. We're seeing this gas run worldwide due to the Russian aggression on Ukraine. And it would not be very smart to create more demand for fossil gas when everyone is really struggling to get some to heat people's homes.
Thank you. We're really running out of time. Jakob, very quickly, what will your fleet look like?
In 5 years from now, I think most of the ship owners, they will realize, okay, it is actually quite doable to build ammonia ship and methanol ships, etc. But we will be pulling our hairs out because it will not be possible to get the fuels we need. So there will not be enough renewable electricity to actually produce the fuel we need. That will be the frustration 5 years from now.
The subject of an entirely different seminar, I'm sure. Lisa, will the IMO have developed policies that are going to help the Arctic community and address your very real concerns?
I certainly hope so. And I see us continuing to voice our thoughts and pushing for all to reduce the emissions that are really damaging our homeland. And so I see our need to continue to have a voice at the IMO.
And I think, Constance, you're the last.
What a privilege. No, but I think, and I really hope that LNG will no longer be seen as the only option available, which is the argument that we constantly hear at the moment. And I think that with big shipping companies having, planning to have their first zero emission vessel to be ready by 2025, I think we'll be in a much more positive place.
Excellent. Well, can I thank you all very much for participating in this event, and for those who are attending, Jutta, Jakob, Brian, Alan, Lisa, and Constance, thank you very, very much once again. Been excellent. You've raised some very, very thought-provoking points here, and we shall sign off. Thank you. Good evening, good afternoon, or good morning. Thank you.
Thank you, and goodbye.
Thank you.